Okay, good evening, everyone. For the sake of time, we will get started. But I wanted to thank you all for taking part in today's advisor series. We had a great series last week and are excited to continue our conversation again this week. As we had said last week, or if you're a first-time tuner in this week, feel free to utilize the chat function, introduce yourself, use it as an introductory way to get to know some of our other advisors, but also know who is on the call. You can also utilize the Q&A feature in order to submit questions to either myself and Nikia or our two panelists in order to ask any questions that might come to mind about our topic today. We are super excited to continue this conversation. We also understand that the topic of social justice is a conversation that is not going to be able to cover everything in the course of an hour. So we hope that these conversations continue to be had outside of the parameters of this webinar itself. But we hope that you enjoy our conversations that we will have with our panelists. So I will start off with some introductions of our panelists first. So first on our panel, we have Dr. Chelsea A. Doub, identifies as a scholar practitioner with backgrounds in both public health and education, sprinkled with a passion for social justice. Currently, she is using her skills as a knowledge specialist in instructional design at McKinsey and Company. Chelsea's bachelor's, master's, and doctoral training have refined her research knowledge in examining the human psyche at the intersections of human behavior, learning design, and societal development. But simply put, she loves studying and working with people. Chelsea's interdisciplinary knowledge prepared her for a distinguished level of human advocacy and instruction in hopes of empowering people across the globe to lead and live with integrity. She holds a bachelor's in biobehavioral health from Penn State University, a master's in public health from Yale University, and a PhD in educational research and policy analysis from North Carolina State University. She has worked for 7 institutions of post-secondary education and over 2,000 students from San Francisco to South Africa. Chelsea is a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, but also had the privilege of working across councils, and most recently served as a resident director for Alpha Delta Pi at NC State University. Our other panelist is Joseph Thompson. He serves as the Assistant Director for Student Development at Stockton University, where he oversees the fraternity and sorority community. He has 10+ years of professional experience as a student affairs professional. Joe has a master's degree in college student affairs from Rutgers University and a bachelor's degree in history and secondary education from Susquehanna University. Joseph is a brother of Phi Mu Delta fraternity and is currently serving as their national treasurer. He is also a speaker for Greek University, where he focuses on topics of social justice and healthy masculinity. So I'm excited to have both of you here, and thank you for joining us today. As we start off the conversation, our first question that we are really focusing on for discussion is, what steps can and should fraternities and sororities take to address issues of exclusion or bigotry within their organizations?
Should one of us just get started? All right. Hi, everybody. How are you? Joe Thompson here. So as I was thinking about this question, the first thing that came to mind is, first, we must acknowledge that we will not always see issues of exclusion or bigotry with our own eyes as advisors who are not with members of the chapter every day. Everything might seem rosy in our chapters, but we do not know the individual experiences of our undergraduate members at all times. They are not always going to tell us, particularly if they are one of the only members of color in the chapter, for example. They may already feel isolated and fearful of speaking up in these situations. So it is not always simply an issue of exclusion, rather an issue of the sense of community and truly feeling a part of an organization, which can be hard for those individuals. I like to point out here that access does not equal inclusion. A lot of the time our undergraduates feel that, oh, we have diverse membership, we're inclusive, or a diverse organization, but it doesn't necessarily equate to those individuals fully feeling a part of the organization. So just because we have members of diverse backgrounds in our chapters does not mean we are truly being inclusive. So as Matt said, I'm a Greek advisor at Stockton University in Southern New Jersey. It would be naive of me to think that there are no such issues in my community, particularly if no one comes and talks to me about it, right? So these are societal issues that we're speaking about here, and our chapters are microcosms of society, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. So therefore, these issues are going to be ever present, and therefore we must always be intentional and assume that they are happening and will continue to happen, unfortunately. Addressing these issues head on, I think, is extremely important. We can't be beating around the bush. It's my belief that every chapter should be participating in programming that addresses issues of oppression and privilege, racism, microaggressions. And we can talk a little bit about what those things mean if anybody has any questions, but more times than not, the issues that I actually see as a fraternity and sorority advisor or hear about in chapters are actually the microaggressions, more so than overt racism. So with your chapter, it's important to consider these issues in recruitment, in the new member program, general activities of the organization, right? So again, these issues are ever present. Our work in doing something about these issues should also be ever present. The language that we use should always be reflected on. So this is a continuous process. And I think that's the important thing to note is, no one's going to solve racism or solve homophobia, in society or in our chapters. I think it's understanding that this is continuous work that we must always be addressing. And, with our organizations, it's time we move away from simply not being racist to actually being anti-racist, which I'm sure many of you have probably heard that in the past, 2 months in particular. But I really believe in that notion. There's a true difference between, someone who's not racist or not homophobic and someone who's actually anti, which means they're actively actually doing something about it, right? So, one thing I will say, thinking about what I saw, particularly this past semester in the spring is, and reflecting on my own campus, and I'm sure, Temple's very similar. We saw chapters on every college campus across the country, basically posting on their social media about Black Lives Matter and supporting that movement, things like that. And I thought that was wonderful. But at the same time, I don't want to be pessimistic. But I also view these things as performative in some way, right? So we create this appearance that we care, and maybe in that moment we truly feel like we care and we're doing something, but our activism needs to go beyond what we post on social media. What I really want to see is, what are we actually doing to make change, right? How are we being active in making that change? That's what I mean when I say we need to move to being anti-racists. It's about being intentional in everything that we do, acknowledging the racism all around us, and actually, acting against it. If there is a specific issue of bigotry or racism in our chapter, you obviously have to follow the procedures of the specific organization. But anyway, the incident can actually be used as a teachable moment, I think is really important, but it should not end there. Again, it has to be continuous. It needs to be a continuous part of discussions among membership, just as we would many other issues. As Greek organizations, we focus so much on, recruiting new members, things like that, but sometimes we do a terrible job at actually supporting them once we're there. And I think that's what all of this comes down to, right? Again, it's the difference between access and inclusion, right? So I think that's really what's important in this matter.
I think those are all great points, and I think not uncommon to Stockton. Temple also has, released their statements from different chapters, and we have seen some continued to, make posts and change, and want to not just, oh, here's my nice picture of us back to normal, but like, here is how we are continuing this conversation. So I think, those are all great points that you brought up in that conversation, Joe. Any thoughts on your end, Chelsea? On that?
Yeah. So I think when it comes to exclusion and bigotry, when we think about those words, at the heart of that is bias, right? And many of us really don't want to address our biases publicly with, sometimes with close friends, but just in general, we're not people who like to embrace our bias very much, right? And so as you think about fraternity and sorority life and what this means for new members, for current members, for future members, for advisors, there's essentially a layer, or there are layers of unraveling that need to be done that most people don't want to participate in. When you think about legacies of organizations and the history of organizations on college campuses, right? You're not just looking at what exists for students, but you're also looking at what systems have been upheld. And fraternity and sorority life has upheld probably historically the most amount of systems within colleges and universities than any other system that's probably in place. But because of that, we're least likely to engage in any type of unraveling process or any type of undoing process that it truly addresses bias, hate, and exclusion. I think if you were to do an anonymous poll with your participants and say, why does Gamma Phi Beta make me feel like I belong? You would have some really great things. But if you also sent out a survey that says, what does Gamma Phi Beta do that makes me feel like I don't belong, you would probably be shocked by answers that you would have never uncovered before. Regardless of the person's race, nationality, language, religion, whatever, everyone has a position within diversity and inclusion to feel like they are, one, their identity is upheld, two, that they belong, and three, that they can utilize their voices to uplift others. And in order to do that within these spaces, we have to let down these rigid beliefs of how we are, one, supposed to operate, and two, how we should continue to move forward. We have these ideas of what we want our organizations to look like. We have these ideas of what we want our social media presence to be, what our next recruiting shirts are going to look like, how we're going to make our new members come out, right? We have all of these products, but we oftentimes don't take a step back and say, what is it about these processes that excludes X amount of people? What is it about our new member intake that consistently leaves other voices out, or that we bypass every single year and say, we'll address that next year? At what point in time will you take a critical look at your process and say, that is biased and we need to do something about it? So I think at the heart is, being able to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, this may have stood for the last 108 years, but it's 2020. And we need to move forward in a way that is truly inclusive and truly embodies our values, and in a way that allows us to continue to grow as an organization as well.
Thanks for that, Chelsea. I appreciate you bringing up the historical context of our organizations. And I think it's a real challenge for even from an international level, for us to let go of some of those systems. And I think some of it is, as times have changed and society has progressed and continues to need some progress, there's a lot that is written down in our formal documents that makes it really challenging for us to defy maybe what our founders envisioned in practice for this experience. How can can students put those values into action? How can we move away from the statements, as Joe and Matt pointed out, and really dig into developing change agents among our members?
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes back to agency, of an emboldening your members so that they feel that they have a voice and they understand how their organization is also moving forward in this society and in this culture that we are all in. I think when you look at, I was just listening to a podcast this morning, and they were talking about how our two candidates for president are from the silent generation. They're plus 70 years old, right? And so we think about and there are people in one specific, I think it may have been Missouri or Minnesota, that there was a local town in which almost all of the representatives and people who were running the town were like younger millennials, like 20s millennials, right? And, we think about those differences and how we're able to come together and recognize what it is that we can take from the past and what we need to propel us forward. I think being able to elevate certain voices, to utilize new ways of thinking, to utilize technology, to educate other people about, people throughout our organizations about why we're moving in the direction that we're moving. I once saw this quote that said, if you're over the age of 45 and you don't have a mentee who is or a mentor who is under the age of 30, you're missing out on a completely new generation of thinking. And so as we think about reverse mentoring and what that means for understanding and growth in our society, we're changing, we're evolving. This is not the 20th century anymore, right? Like, we cannot think about our membership, our inclusion, our approaches in the same way. So as you move forward in engaging and having those conversations, elevate voices that may be different from yours, but also may be beneficial for the growth of your organization. Maybe they may be unique for your context or your specific population, but there's so much data out there that the more diverse an organization or a company or whatever a group is, the more successful they will be, inevitably. So in the end, it's only going to benefit your immediate members, your immediate membership, and in the long run, the longevity of your organization.
This is Joe. Now, I agree with everything that she just shared. I think agency is extremely important. I think the thing that, in relation to that our students often, I think in this generation, there's probably two schools of thought here, but in terms of social responsibility, we have those young people who are always willing to go and be active and go to a protest and do all of these things, and they're advocating for everyone to go vote, and they have this sense of social responsibility. But we have a lot of students that will sit idly by and be complacent to some degree, and feel that them posting on social media that they're making a difference. So going back to that whole concept of everybody posting online, I think that's the thing that we really have missed out on, is really teaching these folks a greater sense of social responsibility. I see it with my students at Stockton in terms of what they view as doing community service. This is a conversation I've had with Matt for a very long time. Matt's actually one of my former students, and we had this conversation a lot while he was at Stockton. It's something that we see in our community is the students get really proud about their service, but what they view as service is very interesting. When I was in school, it was all face-to-face, hands-on, and the students today we're seeing a large increase, at least on my campus, of them doing very passive programming. They're tabling whatever is the easiest thing they can do between classes. They view as service. But I think, again, that relates to the whole idea that I can post on social media and I've done my part. It's kind of taking the easy way out. And, for that reason, that's where I see, I fear, the ability for some people to get, and I think it's a comfort zone thing, but we really need to support students' agency and give them the understanding that, we need to empower them and have them feel like they can really make change, but it requires them to act, and that's extremely important.
And I think Matt and I, and for our advisors likely too, are in this interesting position where, as Chelsea stated, fraternities and sororities have this kind of spotlight on us where we are expected to do. So we talk about the statements being performative, and maybe some things oftentimes feel as photo ops, but we do have senior leadership that's like, XYZ organization didn't write a statement. What's up with that? Or we're not hearing some of the things that our organizations should be doing in the community. So I think there's always this dual space, or this struggle for a balance, as far as students really standing up for things that they care about, but needing someone to know that they stood up and that they cared about it.
I mean, I think affirmation is important in any context, right? Like, you should be able to be recognized in some capacity for your effort to educate others, or, when necessary or applicable, right? And I think with this generation, I totally understand what you're saying, Joe, in terms of the need, or kind of this passive method of activism. But part of me wants to push back on it. Part of me wants to agree in terms of, just what social media can launch movements, right? Like, we see what's happening in Portland. Like, there's a lot of data across the world of like different places in regions in which just a simple tweet has launched like an actual protest for marginalized and underrepresented populations from different communities. And so I think there is value in being able to post on social media and gain respect in social media, especially if you have agency, but then also especially if what you're sharing is a counter narrative of what is typically endorsed from within your immediate circle. So if I'm consistently posting about, I don't know, say the Kardashians, right? And all of a sudden I post about Black Lives Matter, I'm going to capture people's attention. And I think that there is some type of, value in that in different ways. In terms of engaging people and getting young people involved, I think that really means what really it goes back to is being able to put that agency in their hands. And this is where I think our national standards, sometimes we run into trouble of like having prescriptive outcomes that you have to have each year without allowing too much room for flexibility of what organizations feel like is important to them, or even what is important to their local community, right? So I think this is the part in which you have to really, and social justice can really come into conversation and massage your thinking around what is a disparity that we're experiencing in Philly right now, or in a specific neighborhood, or whether it's having to do with low birth weight babies, or maybe recidivism, or something of that nature, right? Like, how are we thinking about our local community? How are we thinking about the people that are within our organization and how they're utilizing their skills to better impact the community? When I was at NC State, it was really interesting being with living with 40 20-year-olds in Alpha Delta Pi, and just like hearing their conversations all day, and you're just like, oh my gosh, the things that you all are talking about are like not important, but and then they would switch conversation. And like, I attended an engineering university for my master's, and they would start talking about aerospace engineering and nuclear engineering and all of these different, very sophisticated classes that they were taking. And so then we started talking about applications and what applications they could use to better serve the Raleigh community and rural North Carolina. Right? Like, how are they utilizing their skills within their sorority to possibly develop an application that can serve people in a better way? And so we were talking about access to groceries and food deserts, and creating a system in which the Greek organizations in that area could help serve food deserts in North Carolina, and start like using their actual trucks to shuttle out food and things like that. So I think part of being able to massage people's activism within themselves is helping them think creatively about what is it about me that will help, you know, my organization and help my organization help, whether it's my local community, national community, or whatever we're passionate about. So giving them that authority and agency from the jump, I think, is really critical.
Awesome. So we have talked a lot about some proactive ways to talk about social justice and ways that chapters can engage, kind of to change it to a more reactive conversation. What if, and this has happened at Temple, as I'm sure at multiple other universities, someone says or posts something that is derogatory or insensitive. How should, in your opinion, chapters respond when a member does something to that degree?
So, so yeah, this has definitely happened at our university as well. And, you know, I think in these situations, obviously what the response from, you know, from a, you know, disciplinary standpoint is going to be different from organization to organization. You know, some chapters are going to immediately remove that person. Some may just suspend them for a while, and, you know, whatever. I guess it's situational. I've got my own opinion on what should happen there, but I'll keep that to myself. But I think in these cases, my personal opinion is it's really difficult for 18 to 22-year-olds in particular, you know, in these situations to respond in a way, right? They're not sure what to do. And they're going to be coming to you as advisors. They're going to be coming to Nikia and Matt and I as the Greek advisors, and they're going to be looking for guidance on what to do here. They're going to be going to their headquarters and saying what to do. We're probably going to get very different responses from all of those different parties. And obviously, you know, the headquarters are going to come in and probably tell them very specifically what to do and not to do. In instances where I've seen this, I actually, again, and this is bordering on, you know, what's performative and what's not, but if an organization is really taking the situation seriously, and is holding that member accountable, you know, it's using that situation and not hiding that situation. More times than not, right? If these things happen in the fraternity and sorority community, if an organization tries to keep it hush hush, you know, remove that member quietly, other people are going to know about it. It's going to get out there. And then the viewpoint of the rest of the Greek community and the university community is going to be that they had this incident and they try to hide it. You know, so it's always been my opinion that it's better to be upfront about these situations, take ownership of the situation. You know, we had someone in our organization who did X, Y, and Z. This doesn't represent our values. You know, this person was removed or whatnot. And then what are the steps that your chapter is taking to be a better organization, to actually to re-engage members in conversations around this, to try to ensure that these things don't happen again, that our members have an understanding of these issues, that those who are in our organization who might have been directly affected by it have the support in place, so that they don't feel alienated or isolated, or members that might come out for recruitment. I think it's about looking at the bigger picture, and really, you know, going to work as a chapter. As I said, it should be continuous work anyway, but these things kind of lend as teachable moments, but also allow the chapter to kind of say, hey, look, this is what happened in our organization. We're taking ownership of it, and this is what we're doing about it.
Yeah, so I guess just to dovetail off of that, I think the ownership piece is very key. And I think also when these incidents happen, you know, when we initially had the conversation for this conversation, Nikia and I are sorority sisters from Penn State. And so, you know, we kind of reflected on, I was reflecting a little bit on what it meant to be able to have a challenging conversation with one of your, you know, brothers or sisters, right? And so I think a lot of what I've experienced with Zoomers, Gen Z in particular, is being able to have challenging conversations with one another. And because social media is the medium that people like to have difficult conversation, it makes it even more difficult to address things in person. So I think we kind of have to go back to the basics of being able to sit down. And I think back to being an RA, of like what RA training consisted of, and being able to have tough conversations with people who were also my peers. And a lot of young people simply just aren't trained to do that. Many of us are not equipped to do that, right? We would rather not face any type of disruption, and, you know, kind of just stay in our own bubble than have something difficult confront us. So coaching your members through having those difficult conversations with each other, and then also, you know, just even inviting others to open discussion about what it means to, you know, share, you know, your thoughts and your beliefs on social media. Have, you know, common understanding among your members of, you know, have a sit down chat about that. Have a real talk about, you know, what does it mean to tweet about, you know, politics, you know, with these letters on my chest? What does it mean to tweet about politics when I'm riding around with this, you know, Delta Sigma Theta frame or you know, Mu Eta frame, whatever it is, right? Like, can I do that openly and still represent my organization? And that's something I have to think about too, is as a Black woman, as you know, people look at me and say, oh, she's the AKA too, like she just tweeted that or she just posted that, right? Like I have to think about that consistently, and molding that mindset and molding that understanding of how you're representing yourself in your organization, while also being able to engage in critical and conscious conversation, is what we should be grooming our members to do.
I think that's an excellent point. We hear a lot of students who come in and they can articulate that they want to be a part of something bigger than themselves, but that's siloed to maybe the hands-on service or some of the more social benefits of being in an organization, not that accountability piece, or as you mentioned, having those hard conversations. As Temple University has dealt with issues like this, I think a few things have come up that have challenged students, kind of mixed opinions around cancel culture and, you know, is removing someone for quote unquote one mistake the right move to make, and how to balance that with accountability. We have been able to support chapters in mediated some conversations, really trying to create a space where folks can share how they're feeling, ask for what they need, but definitely think that we are a long ways away from creating this space and this ongoing culture where we can talk about relevant things among our chapters. Our diversity among the Temple Fraternity and Sorority community is a true point of pride for our staff. And we joke all the time that our students have no idea what to do with that diversity, that we're all just here and we never talked about where we came from, what makes up our unique stories. And I think that to Chelsea's point, that's what makes it so challenging when things happen on a global or even a local level, to then jump back in and have these conversations when we're not used to talking about the things that make each of us unique. We're kind of having this homogenous experience and not talking about those differences from member to member.
So it makes me think of like knowing our organizations, what is an effective way, in your opinion, that advisors can create this culture where we have these kinds of conversations and feel comfortable having these conversations as advisors who maybe didn't have this experience as an undergraduate member of having these conversations with their own chapter members? Any thoughts on tips or tricks for advisors to start pushing or having some of these conversations with the collegiate members?
Well, I think that for the advisors on the phone, you know, I've always had difficulty myself having, you know, these critical conversations with students. And obviously, you know, in the past 10 years, I've vastly improved on having those conversations. I think we need to challenge ourselves to have those conversations with the chapter leadership. And having those conversations with the chapter leadership, then, thinking about that sense of agency, empowering them, supporting them, and having those conversations with the chapter, and there's different strategies into doing that. If you have a chapter of 100 people, it might be hard to reach every single individual, in having a large, program for the chapter and having these critical conversations. But in terms of starting small and kind of doing it in groups and kind of coalition building, I think is a good strategy. But I think it does start with the chapter leadership and with the advisors, because obviously, your greatest tool is your example in setting that example for the chapter. As difficult as it might be for us individually ourselves, right? You're kind of challenging them to have these conversations, while the conversation you're having on your own is challenging for yourself. It's a learning process for everyone. But I think that example is the most important thing that you can do. And again, it's just, we're talking specifically here about racism and bigotry, but teaching our student leaders about how to lead critical conversations and what skills they can gain in order to have very difficult conversations with people, is probably one of the greatest skills they can learn as leaders. In the midst of everything that's going on in our world right now, this is a perfect opportunity to start with this. And no, again, it's that setting that example and challenging ourselves to have these things, which might mean that we need to have some, teach ourselves a little bit in terms of these topics, to have these conversations. But just starting off small and just talking with the chapter leadership and saying, so how do we actually feel our members, do our members all feel actually included in our organization? Like, what are your feelings on that? And starting out small, and then just building up to a deeper conversation, right? So, because it is uncomfortable, again, 18 to 22-year-olds in particular, particularly if the group is, we're talking particularly about white students, and we're having conversations about racism, it's very uncomfortable for these individuals. So I think we need to start somewhere, but it starts with ourselves as well.
Yeah, I agree that it definitely starts with self. And what makes this, I think, tremendously more easy as you move along is being able to understand your identity and how your identity fits into this larger narrative. What I've found is that a lot of times people who are engaging with fraternity and sorority men and women, they typically haven't done the work. They're reacting to what Nationals is asking them to do. They're reacting to what their school or institution is asking them to do, without understanding, hey, I don't really know why I uphold these beliefs. I don't understand. I'm not even sure why I don't think I've ever done a deep dive into my identity, maybe as a white person or as a female or as a person who identifies as a Christian, and what it means to be Christian and the privileges it affords me in this country, right? And how that may afford my members also different levels of privileges and different levels of understanding. And so once you've done that deep dive and that homework yourself, I do believe it becomes even easier for you to be able to like clearly see what the next move is. And part of that is in leadership. I don't know if Temple has leadership, but we call it vision priming, right? And so being able to prime your vision of understanding of who it is who will help you become an agent of change, and then how can you make that vision apply specifically within the population that you're working with. So we typically have this idea of like, yeah, we want small groups, we want book clubs, doing all of these things, but what's going to work for my small MGC organization of 8 people? What's going to work for my IFC organization of 122, right? And understanding the nuances of those groups in between. Maybe are there certain things that are taking up their time or their attention right now? How can you possibly intertwine, inclusion exclusion, diversity into these narratives of what their attention is focusing on, right? So molding your vision for how you can essentially impact the organization in the long run, and writing those things out. Maybe it's a short-term action plan, maybe it's a long-term action plan. Maybe that's having small conversations with the executive board first, or having individual conversations with different members about belonging, about what it means to, belong on campus and also nationally, right? Of gathering your own understanding of what it is that you can do to actually create change, because there is no one size fits all for this. Every chapter is different. Every organization is different. And so being able to recognize what your needs are and conducting that micro needs assessment can really add value to how sustainable your efforts will be.
Chelsea, I think you brought up a lot of really great points around identity and how it shows up from an advisor lens and working with a fraternity or a sorority. I think there's a lot of unique identities that show up in the fraternal world. We got a comment in the Q&A that discusses thinking about advising a chapter that maybe you weren't initiated in. How can we build diverse advising teams that may help move some of these conversations along? So when we think about age, when we think about race and ethnicity, again, am I affiliated with that chapter or organization or not? The majority of our faculty staff advisors are either not affiliated at all or may not be affiliated in the particular chapter they advise. So just thinking about how we can foster those strong relationships that are going to move us along as it relates to social justice conversations.
Yeah, like what I'm hearing in that is, how do I build trust? Right? So in order to be able to impact any type of group, you have to gain their trust in some way, shape, or form. And while that may be a big barrier, it's not something that can, it's not something that's not attainable, right? You can slowly build trust in these areas should you become vulnerable, should you open up, should you have, those unique opportunities in which you can show people yourself. I think through my experience in working with different organizations, with folks who may not for people who are advising and may not identify with the group that we're working with, being able to find those nuggets of sameness, those nuggets of belonging, those opportunities for people to be able to connect on a more interpersonal level. Because at the end of the day, this is a generation that loves highly tailored, highly me, specific type things. And so having those intimate conversations with members of sharing, and that's how things spread. Like, even from other organizations, there was this one advisor who was the organization advisor for Kappa Alpha Psi, right? And so he was the one person that everybody knew through word of mouth. That was really cool. Like, I had never met him before, but everyone knew that he was an ally, that he was, would advocate for us when you needed to have that advocacy, or he would be able to, show up for you should you need it at a program. And so I think to be able to actually have impact, you have to learn how to build trust in those micro ways, those micro affirmations that can really add value during times like this, so people can see that this is a person that I have been able to trust in the past, and they have demonstrated that this is something that they're interested in helping me with. And so going forward, I can lean on them. I can rely on them if need be.
Could not say that any better.
Thank you. I think one thing I just wanted to plug, because I think a large part of us doing this web series were a couple of advisors asking, one, like, how can we create a peer group among advisors? I think some of you have dealt with more challenging situations than others. And so how can we learn from each other and share best practices among the group? I think this is step one in that process. I think step two for us was really working with our team to develop these like how-to conversation guides. So when acknowledging where we are in our knowledge and expertise around a particular topic, but really trying to create this foundational way to have conversations about race, ethnicity, identity, culture, in the same, really, as we move into our conversations about mental health and sexual violence, among other things. So, you know, as I mentioned last week, we don't expect our advisors to be experts, but exactly what Joe and Chelsea said, those guides really start with a reflection piece for the advisor to think about, you know, where am I at as it relates to this topic, and what are the things that I might need to think about or prepare going into this conversation with the students. A lot of our students are figuring out for the first time that they have different values and beliefs than a lot of their friends. And I would argue the same for some of their family members. And it's because they're just starting to talk about these things. So if you talk about these things all the time, it's definitely going to be a lot easier for you to facilitate discussion among the students. But challenging you all to lean on us when needed, but to really take that first step into, you know, at the dinner table, having conversations about things that matter.
I think too, if we're looking for like grounds to kind of start with, about a month ago, we posted on social media a let's talk about inclusion conversations to trying to think through identity-based ways that we can address systems. So some of those things include like, what is our relationship with pageants or with sweethearts? In those conversations, thinking about what are the events that we're hosting and what connotations do those events have. Thinking through, you know, if we are only doing events with if we are a fraternity, we're only doing events with sororities and we don't feel comfortable doing events with other fraternities. Thinking through what those relationships look like. If we, for example, host a line and might have someone who is wheelchair bound, what do those relationships look like? Or are we only going to address that when it is time to address it? Thinking through what our conversation around spirituality and religion look like. A lot of our organizations are founded around a certain religion. So how do we have conversations around this? So there's a lot of conversations that we need to have. And it's really just focusing in on like, what is that thing that the students want to attach to and you can help them to attach to address. We can't do all of these in one semester and knock them all out. But how do we have some of these conversations to just address that one thing that then can lead to the next thing being addressed and so on and so forth. So that way we can continue to start making leeway on our systematic issues within our organizations themselves. I think one of the final questions that I really want to talk through and hear the panelists' perspective on is the notion of justice. So a lot of our organizations have justice as a value from a national perspective. What or how do our organizations live out that value of justice as an organization, knowing that it is a national value of that organization?
So I have some opinions on this. So this is one area of conversation that I have with my students all the time. And it's that, you know, we as fraternal organizations, fraternities and sororities, we have these values, these pillars that we have within our organization, but how much do we actually talk about those things? You know, so one of the things that I actually work with all my chapter leaders to do, and whether they do it or not is, you know, yet to be seen, but, you know, is to actually talk about their ritual, talk about their creed, talk about their values. Justice is actually part of my fraternity's core values. And, you know, I've led conversations basically to say, okay, so let's go through, let's talk about justice tonight. What does justice mean to you? What do you think justice means in relation to our organization? How does it play out in our everyday lives? And just start with that conversation and just go around the room. And I think a simple activity like that as a starting point is really good for all of our organizations to do. whether it's justice or whatever else are you know, our pillars, or you know, are, because I don't think we do that enough as fraternal organizations. And it's kind of ironic to me, because we're values based and we don't necessarily talk about our values all the time. But, you know, justice obviously is an extremely important one, and so many of our organizations share that as one of our pillars. You know, it's just to start there. What does that mean to you? What does that mean in relation to our organization? How does that play out? And when I say how does that play out, you know, in relation to our organization, you know, how on a daily basis or in the big picture, where does that come into play? And let's talk about it in regards to recruitment and our new member program, our education program, our service, our philanthropy. What does that mean? You know, how can we celebrate that justice as a part of our organization in the things that we do as a chapter? You know, but you have to start by defining it. And if your undergrads are not having that conversation, then they're never going to get to that point. And I think that's extremely important, because something that I learned is sometimes we are extremely naive in thinking that our undergrads have a good grasp of, you know, what our values actually mean. You know, we don't talk about it enough.
Yeah, and so I kind of had a similar answer in terms of like evaluating your values and looking what that means individually per person, but then also as a chapter, there needs to be a differential understanding between what our values are and what we are valuing, right? Because we often talk about the need to be community service oriented and have high scholastic and ethical standards and things of that nature, right? I'm just naming stuff for my own mission, right? But and I'm not trying to throw Alpha Kappa Alpha under the bus either. I'm just using it as an example, right? And so as we think about our values and things that we're stating, but then on the back end, we continue to uphold misogynistic or sexist or racist behaviors, whether that's exclusionary within the house, whether maybe there's, you know, something written, an old creed or some sort that could be offensive, right? How are we thinking about those literal things that we're continuing to uphold from day to day? Not just what lies in our heart, but what is it that we're exuding into the world? And I think that is really what we're afraid to look at, because it really, it makes us look in the mirror, and it makes us, you know, put a real dense look in our eyes and say, what is it that we're missing, right? We're looking at ourselves in the most critical way possible of like, this is not something that I really want to embody, or this is not something that I want us to keep doing. And having the courage to admit and having the courage to say those things is what really leads to the failures in these areas of upholding those values. And I think that is what chapters and advisors need to be able to do, is say, this is not something that we want to hold on to within the next year or within the next 5 years. So let's work to disassemble this piece of our, you know, tradition, or maybe this is something we need to restate or reword or rework, right? But it requires a critical eye to be able to say, this is wrong, and we need to do something about it.
I love that. And I think that growth mentality speaks really well to what we look for through our Diamond Accreditation program. Y'all know I wasn't going to end this without talking about Diamond Accreditation. So when we think about the difference between our, you know, a 3-diamond organization and a 4-diamond, it's really that intentionality, and it's really being able to articulate purpose, not just that I did service, but here was the impact, that, you know, not just that we live out our values, but the how. And I think that process that Joe described can really help add back in that intentionality and purpose into the things that we are really proud of and did really well, but the development is in the students being able to articulate that experience and tie it back into our founder's vision. As we wrap up, I really just wanted to draw attention to what Chelsea added in the chat, and that our goal should equal I may not be an expert, but I am informed and growing and understanding. I think another way to put this, Chelsea mentioned, we're from the same chapter, and we really prided ourselves on feeling like I don't know isn't enough. Like, I can't just say I don't know. It's got to be I don't know, but I'm going to learn. And again, having that growth mindset that we're constantly trying to be better. This experience is supposed to be making us better citizens. And if we focus solely on how to be members, how to be good members, how to flag posts on social media, how to remove members when they do something wrong, and we miss the boat constantly around how do we make better men and women, then we're selling ourselves short on what this experience really can be. So I just want to say thank you for all of our advisors hopping on and being a part of this process with us. I say it every week, you are such an integral part of us taking the students along on this journey. And it really starts with having these types of conversations to make sure that they understand the purpose behind all of the what feels like hoops and maybe some hurdles as it relates to their fraternal experience.
Yes, so I want to be cognizant of time, and seeing that it is 7 o'clock, I want to thank you all for coming this evening and attending our advisor session, whether you were here with us in person or watching virtually from our recording. I, again, just really thank our panelists for taking their time out of their day to have this conversation and really start the conversation with us, because we know that this is a continued process and it is one that we will be continuing to have as we continue to advise and support our students as they also are navigating this experience. I do want to also send a reminder that next week, same time, same place, we will be having a conversation on sexual violence prevention, knowing that this has also been a big conversation for our community, knowing that there has been a lot of conversation specifically from our Napa and NALFO friends about some of our call-out culture, but we want to help and support our advisors through both addressing sexual violence, but also supporting survivors of sexual violence. So we will have that conversation at 6 o'clock next Wednesday. So we're excited to have you. And again, thank you for both of our panelists. We hope you enjoy the rest of your night.
Thanks, everyone.